This has never been done before, Dr. Riley said excitedly to the assembled team, brushing a lock of straight black hair behind her ear. The bright fluorescent lights of the laboratory sparkled off her glasses. If successful, this will be a first for the human species, a first for science and technology. We should all be proud. The experiment will begin in 60 seconds, a female robotic voice stated calmly through the speakers, sounding as cool as a swimming pool on a hot day. Please put on your safety glasses now. The laboratory door will automatically lock in 3 seconds. After a slight pause, the mechanical deadbolts clicked shut, locking the heavy steel door in place. Our team of a dozen highly esteemed researchers and scientists watched through the safety glass. I observed the tons of iron and nickel piled high in the laboratory with a sense of awe. The square blocks of metal loomed hundreds of feet in the air. Many hundreds of thousands of pounds of material would be used to create the first black hole. The experiment area itself was the size of a football stadium and had cost billions of dollars to construct. No one knew what to expect. Some of the scientists had bet that the experiment would not work, that the gravitational well created by the thousands of lasers and superconducting magnets would be insufficient to create a black hole of any size. Others bet that a micro-black hole would be created, but that it would evaporate in a matter of milliseconds or even nanoseconds. Magnetic well activated, the robotic voice stated calmly as a deep vibrating hum started all around us. The metal cubes in the enormous laboratory shook and danced as if the first tremors of an earthquake had passed through the floor. Slowly, the enormous cubes twitched and clattered against the concrete floor. Within a couple seconds, they began slowly rising into the air, hundreds of thousands of pounds of crushing, suffocating weight, hovering a few inches above the ground. The countless gigantic magnets surrounding the laboratory gave a cyclical whirring cacophony. It sounded as if the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were flying in circles around us, shaking the entire building with their fury and might. Lasers will activate in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. All the scientists and researchers counted down with the cold robotic voice, mouthing the words as the penultimate moment arrived. I forgot myself in the roaring of the group consciousness. All the colors of the world seemed to grow brighter and more saturated. A collective gasp went through the room as a blinding light poured out from the shatterproof glass windows in front of us. It felt as if I were staring into the dawn of creation and seeing the Big Bang itself. The dark shielding of the protective glasses prevented the cosmic explosion from permanently blinding me, though I still had to turn my face away after a few moments. The eruption felt like staring straight into the face of God. I feared my eyes would melt out of my head. But as the energy increased, I also felt a sickening, suffocating glee rising up through my chest. My face melted into a wide, toothy grin, even as I screamed internally. I felt like I couldn't control it. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. "Make it stop," I shrieked, but I couldn't hear my own voice. I covered my ears with my gloved hands and cringed away. It sounded as if the entire universe were collapsing, as if the sun had gone supernova and erupted into pure energy. I backpedaled, slamming into someone. I saw a white lab coat blur across my vision as someone fell, but I couldn't see anything in the observation room besides countless rivers of light slicing their way through the air. I was still screaming when everything suddenly went quiet and dark. I stood alone in the opaque wall of shadows, watching and waiting. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine that slowly faded away. After that, only the sound of my own ragged breathing and racing heart accompanied me. A soft white light started to glow on the other side of the glass. It brightened over the space of a few seconds. I blinked fast, letting my eyes adjust to the onslaught of cosmic light and absolute darkness that had strobed past over the last few minutes. As I peered in through the fogged windows, I realized the gleam of a giant floating eye stared back at me. The eye itself was inhuman and slitted like a snake's. The pupil shone out like a black hole. Snapping currents of electricity sizzled and jumped over its surface. Its surface gleamed a uniform, spotless bone white. The eye hovered a few feet over the ground, extending up 50 or 60 feet in the air, the size of a large house. Hello? I cried out through the thick layer of protective glass. The lone, demonic eye continued to stare down at me, lidless and unblinking. Am I dreaming? A hand came down on my shoulder. I jumped, spinning around to see Dr. Riley standing there. Blood streamed from her nose and a few crimson drops fell from her eyes and ears. She opened her mouth, her face contorting like a corpse's. Nothing came out of her mouth for a few moments, however. She collected herself, lifted her glasses, and wiped the blood from her eyes. The crimson streak smeared across her cheeks. Then she inhaled deeply and looked me straight in the face. I saw the ineffable horror and existential terror I felt reflected back at me. "We need to go," she said, grabbing my arm. I pulled away, looking around for the first time. I felt like a man waking up from a nightmare only to find his house on fire. I saw corpses of men and women in white lab coats littering the floor. Some of their eyes had exploded. Pools of thick, clotted blood and gore slowly dribbled onto the concrete floor in widening puddles from the empty black sockets. The victims had disturbing death masks. All of them had the same insane rictus grin plastered across their frozen faces. "Is anyone alive here?" I whispered weakly. At the far end of the observation room, a head lifted weakly. Dr. Riley continued trying to pull my arm, but I swatted her away. "There's someone there, look." Her shell-shocked eyes languidly searched the bodies until she saw the weak, struggling movements of the man at the end. I ran towards him as Dr. Riley limped after me. "Is that you, Dr. Evans?" the man said as his eyes rolled wildly. He raised a trembling hand towards me. I recognized him instantly. It was one of our engineers, Rick. He was black, rail-thin, and generally very quiet and serious. I didn't know him that well compared to some of the other members of our team, but at that moment, I was just happy to see anyone. Like Dr. Riley, Rick was not in great shape. He had blood streaming from his right eye and his right ear. His dilated pupils flicked over my face as he breathed hard. I helped pull him to his feet. He put a bony arm around my shoulders. "It's me, buddy," I responded, turning to Dr. Riley. "Look, something went wrong with the experiment. Both of you know it by now. There is something on the other side of the windows. No, don't look. It's watching us." But my words were in vain. I might as well have told two children not to look at the enormous, extremely interesting elephant walking past their school. "Holy shit," Rick said, edging closer to the window and wiping blood away from his face. The eye continued to stare at me through the window. I felt like I was on the wrong end of a microscope. "What is it?" "It's a giant goddamned eye surging with electricity," I said. Dr. Riley's face changed into a look of pure euphoria. "This is first contact," she stated abruptly. "Oh my God, this is it. You think this thing is an alien?" Rick asked slowly. They seemed to have no ill effects from staring into the eye. Cautiously, I drew closer to the glass, peering into the laboratory. All of the enormous cubes of metal had been consumed during the experiment. Behind the eye loomed a black abyss. The power had gone out, and now the only light came from the glowing, floating eye. A sudden, insane urge came over me. I knocked gently on the window. The eye seemed to spin slightly. "Who are you?" I whispered faintly. "I am who I am," it exclaimed in a voice like thunder. Dr. Riley looked awestruck, while Rick gave a high-pitched laugh. "It thinks it's Jehovah," he said, giggling and wiping blood from his eye. That's the same answer God gave to Moses when he asked that exact question. I looked at Rick in astonishment. He stepped forward. "Why are you here?" Rick asked loudly, his voice confident and steady. The eye flicked toward him, the slitted pupil dilating and contracting slightly as it stared in through the window. "I am everywhere at once, yet no one sees me. I pass eternity in the shadows. I have always been here," it roared in a voice like the rushing of a waterfall. My ears rang and the ground shook with every word. It felt like the being was speaking directly into the center of my heart and my mind, rather than transmitting words through the air. "This is really interesting and everything, but I think we should do something about, the dead bodies of our co-workers," I interrupted. Rick and Dr. Riley looked stunned, as if they had just stumbled out of a coma. They glanced back at the bodies littering the floor like dead leaves, seeing the blood dripping out of their exploded eyes. "And we might need medical attention too. I mean, whatever this thing is, it must give off some sort of radiation or something. Looking directly into it during the explosion killed these people in a matter of seconds. The only reason I think I'm not bleeding like you two is because I barely looked through the window for a fraction of a second." "That's a great point," Dr. Riley said, excited. She turned to the eye. "Why did you kill our co-workers?" "No one can look on the face of God except he who is of God," the eye said, the words exploding all around us like nuclear blasts. "The human mind and body cannot experience eternity. It consumes flesh like a virus." "I think we should get out of here," I said. But Rick and Dr. Riley looked at me like I was something they had just scraped off the bottom of their shoes. "Seriously, guys. Do you have any idea of the importance of this moment?" Dr. Riley asked, fixing her glasses. I noticed how the smears of blood covered one of her lenses. "This is either our first contact with an extraterrestrial species, or an encounter with God. Or some sort of God anyway. Perhaps not the Judeo-Christian God, I don't know, but we should be videotaping this," Rick said bitterly. "This will go down in history as the most important scientific event of all time. And yet, we don't even have power or light." "So let's go get some help," I said, but they just looked over at the eye. "I don't want to leave it just yet," Dr. Riley said. "I still have a lot of questions. What if it's gone when we get back?" "Why don't you go get help and we'll stay here and keep an eye on it?" Rick asked, giving a faint half-smile. I watched my two co-workers as they stood, surrounded by the bodies of their friends and colleagues. A shard of ice pierced my heart. "Something's wrong here," I whispered. "Something's terribly wrong." The eye continued to glow marble white, sizzling with blue electricity in the darkness. "I'm leaving," I said. But Dr. Riley and Rick paid me no mind. They drew closer and closer to the glass until their breath fogged it with every exhalation. They whispered more questions at the eye. "How do I find peace?" Rick asked, staring up with adoration, like a mother with her only child. "Through the eternal freedom and peace of death," the voice boomed as I ran out of there, veering down corridors and out the front door. I found military personnel and government officials assembled there, wondering why communications to the building had suddenly gone out. They were all suited up and armed. I tried explaining the situation quickly, but the skepticism on their faces communicated more than their words. "Please, the experiment went wrong," I pleaded. "We tried to create a micro-black hole, but instead, the matter all got consumed and a giant eye appeared. Most of the team died horribly by watching when the matter got compressed to a pinpoint. Some kind of weird radiation seeped in and exploded their eyes and—" Hold on. A general with too many medals glittering on his uniform said as he stepped forward. "A giant eye? Are you saying there is an extraterrestrial life form currently being held in this building?" He turned to his assistant. Put the president on standby until I return. He glanced back over at me. Okay, lead the way. Let's figure out what's happening here once and for all. I led the troop of government officials back towards the observation room. As we wandered down the dark hallways, using flashlights to drive away the creeping shadows, I noticed how quiet everything sounded. The booming voice like rushing water no longer shook the building. I heard no echoes of voices from the observation room either. I walked through the door and found Rick and Dr. Riley hanging from the ceiling. They had taken the electrical cords and fashioned ersatz nooses from them. Their blue lips and swollen tongues showed me immediately that they were both dead. The glowing reptilian eye continued to stare in through the glass, emotionless and cold. "Oh my God," the general said, "it's real. I can't believe it." I crept closer to the window, whispering and pale. "Why did you let me live?" I asked. "Surrounded by darkness, it seems eternal. But for one who sees, there is nothing. You are a seer. You were the only one who knew something was wrong." It boomed. The soldiers and government officials stared up at the eye, some with amazement, others with obsessive interest. They all started to chatter at once. Many called out questions. They all ignored the corpses strewn around the room, moving closer to the glass. Their eyes glittered with euphoria as they stared into the unknown. And I wondered at that moment whether we were all talking to God or the devil.